Welcome to the Whole Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you become a fat burner, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey everybody, it's Debbie Potts doing a new podcast with Zack, the fat adapted endurance athlete we always hear about everywhere if you talk about endurance athletes and low carb, high fat athlete, fat adapted, metabolically efficient. Its definition is Zack Bitter. So I got him on the show today. Thanks for coming on to share your story and how you can create more impact in the endurance world.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's always good to hop on the podcasts, and I know I've heard great things about you from Ross Taylor at F-Bomb, so it's an extra pleasure to come on this one.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just love connecting with different people that are like-minded in the low carb, high fat world, endurance athletes. We started this podcast, used to be Fit Fat Fast, back in 2011, and it seems like it's until this year, the past 2 years, that it's becoming a little bit more known and common word to be fat adapted athlete. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, it's definitely kind of found its way into the vernacular, I think. And it's I guess, depending on who you ask, it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a bit of a nebulous term, I think, which gives people some grief. But I think if you kind of come into it with the right mindset, you can kind of wrap your head around what that maybe means for you personally or in general, I guess, too. Yeah,
that's so true. Because I always think of, the low carb athlete. And I just last couple of months is thinking, well, low carb doesn't mean you're burning fat necessarily. And, to really our goal is to be fat adapted and metabolically efficient and metabolically flexible as endurance athlete.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think, one thing that I think I found out, I've been following some form of a high fat, low carb diet for about almost 8 years now. And, one thing I've found, I think, is just like that lifestyle component does play a pretty big role in kind of determining how you're going to structure a high fat, low carb diet. And, that's one of the things I find most interesting about the growth of that kind of an approach is when I first started, it was kind of, at least to my knowledge, it was just like kind of, there was keto, and, keto had some fairly defined parameters of, say like 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, especially when you look at its kind of origins with as a therapeutic usage for like epilepsies and type 2 diabetes type stuff. But then you put in a lifestyle that's drastically different than the average person. There's some, I think, manipulation that can be done and you still be fat adapted, I guess we'll say.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. I know we've all heard a little bit of your story, but what do you find is important reason or the top 3 reasons why endurance athletes should work on nutrition for improving performance and longevity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, one thing I like to look at with endurance athletes is I like to look past the 20s and 30-year-olds, partly just because one of my priorities with really loving endurance sports is I want to be doing it as long as I can, as long as it's fun and exciting to me. And I don't feel like this kind of end and desire coming anytime soon. And for your listeners, I'm 33, so I fit that 20 to 30-year-old time frame. But, I see guys in the sport like Jeff Browning, if you've heard of him. And he's 48 and he switched to a high fat, low carb diet a few years ago and noticed a whole lot of interesting things in terms of just, what he's been able to do in training and racing and just overall life enjoyment by kind of finding a nutrition plan that works for him. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of times we maybe underappreciate how big of a role what food we eat plays in kind of, both your attitude, your personality, your motivation to be active, your ability to be active. And I think there can be a pretty wide range of what people can do to fit that or get that feeling or get that position, themselves in that position. So it's at the end of the day, I think when you start looking at things from a little bit more of a micro analysis as opposed to like a macro analysis. You start finding, well, what is going to work for me individually? And some of that just almost has to be a bit of trial and error. So for me personally, it was like, I started kind of trying out a high fat, low carb diet, and I started noticing some things that were really appealing to me. And some of that was actually outside of the actual, performance piece to the puzzle, but they kind of play what I would call like a role in that, because there's a lot that goes on outside of the workouts itself or the racing itself that's going to kind of get you to your next race or get you to your next workout and feeling good and able to kind of do that. So I think what I would find as most important or most advantageous may not be the same for someone else, or someone may find that a completely different approach would be give them that same thing that I'm looking for. So at the end of the day, I'm always kind of analyzing what I like to call like a field test or results. And results for me as an endurance athlete oftentimes look at how are my workouts? How am I performing in my workouts? How am I performing in my racing? And I use that as kind of like a compass or a guide to decide kind of what foods and what things I'm going to eat and how they're going to kind of help me get to that point. But some things that I find really interesting in my own N=1 kind of approach with a high fat, low carb diet is just, a lot of stuff post activity, a lot of, getting back to training in a quick way and not kind of breaking down continuously to the point where I'm losing that motivation or losing that ability to train. And those are just some kind of basic things that I've noticed in my own experience with it. And, it's an interesting timeline, I guess, because I'm always, I shouldn't say always, but I'm always open to kind of manipulating small things within the context of kind of the approach that I feel works best for me and trying to see what they'll maybe do for me or not.
So I always find that training, what I call the podcast, the whole athlete, to train the whole athlete to improve performance and longevity is not just exercise alone, but nutrition, as we're speaking of, but also, digestion, gut health, stress, the chronic stress impacts everything, and sleeping and mobility drills, the movement and hydration and happiness are the 8 elements of what I call the holistic method coaching program. So what do you feel like you do to help enhance recovery and repair, because you're putting so many miles in your body, and how do you not have it break down and recover, get ready for the next session?
Yeah, no, I like what you said before, because I think when it comes to judging if you're doing things right, there's some kind of canaries in the coal mine that will speak to you early if you're kind of heading down the wrong path or the right path. And I think sleep is one of the big ones that sometimes people overlook. So for me, historically, I'd always been a really good sleeper. Like when I was in high school and college, I would go to bed, I would sleep 8-9 hours without waking up and, be ready to go the next day. And then after I got done with college and started working full time and kind of getting more and more into the extreme endurance side of things, I started noticing some drastic changes in that, where I would be waking up, maybe 3, 4, 5 times a night. And it was taking me quite a bit of time to get back to sleep. And instead of going to bed, say at 10, because I knew I was going to get up at 6:30 and just knew I was going to get 8.5 hours of sleep, I'd be going to bed at 8:30 or 9, just to make sure I could account for the weight, the restless side of trying to get back to sleep. And, that just seemed to be kind of a red flag in my mind in terms of not being something sustainable. So something needed to change in order to fix that. And, that's when I kind of first got curious with a high fat, low carb diet. And that was one of the first things that cleared up. So I think when you start recognizing some of those more intuitive signs, and some of it you can get real analytical with too. You can sleep track and things like that now. But watching those things, watching your energy levels throughout the day, how do you respond to stress? Are you very responsive when stressful situations come up, or does it take you to a place you don't want to be? And balancing that stuff out and keeping an eye on that, I think, are some of the early signs to keep an eye on when you're thinking about what nutrition is going to work best for you.
Well, that's what I've done a lot of podcasts on chronic stress, because I haven't been able to race Ironmans. It was beginning of 2013 from my endurance world of doing trail running, 50Ks and Ironmans, marathons, that I find is more my passion to teach people how to reduce that chronic stress and what we call as an FDN practitioner, it's metabolic chaos that we're creating. So all this accumulation of stressors inside and out create such an internal damage and, impact our performance, obviously, and longevity. But nutrition is a big thing to increase your quality of sleep and recovery and repair. It's if we're eating still high carb, high sugar, processed foods, vegetable oils, having all that really impacts our blood sugar regulation, which is going to impact our sleep because the cortisol, melatonin rhythm is so essential. So it's really, I think, important to look at the whole athlete training, all these different elements, because nutrition is obviously a big part of it, and you figure that out. And I think a lot of people must, ignore those red flags, or like you said, you saw them. Do you find a lot of people in your sport not paying attention to those red flags, or being so type A or triple A that we say personality that they override those and just push through it?
Yeah, it's hard to really know like a specific data point of like, X number of or X percentage of people are dropping out of the sport because they weren't able to manage the training and the recovery appropriately. But it's a common enough topic within the world of endurance that you kind of know it's there. And I think it's on the back of the mind.
Yeah. Froze.
Training or some bad races, they start thinking about, can you hear me all right now?
Yeah, we just froze for a moment.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, I think like it's probably on the back of the mind of a lot of endurance athletes, especially if it's, one of their larger stressors in life. And there is plenty of examples you can find of folks, dropping out of the sport for whatever reason, whether that be, loss of motivation, injury that's keep popping up, or just life and everything else is too encompassing from a stressful side of things. So I think that is really important to kind of look at that whole athlete approach and where nutrition falls into that. And I think a lot of times when we find these situations of athletes kind of burning out, it tends to be they're abusing themselves in more than one direction. And a lot of times nutrition is one of those things that they're doing that is causing them to kind of overreach and find themselves in a position where they're no longer motivated or physically able to kind of keep competing.
Exactly what I was talking about. So what about your experience with your own N=1 to be fat adapted? You switched over how many years ago to be low carb, high fat, and becoming, this well-known endurance, amazing athlete to be doing low carb, high fat in a 100-mile race. And then what did you find to know if you're fat adapted? Do you just, measure your ketones, your blood sugar? How do you know if you're fat adapted, and kind of share that experience?
Yeah, I've definitely done the whole like blood ketone measuring stuff, and I'm curious enough where it's kind of cool to know that stuff. I try not to get overly hung up on that, mainly just because at the end of the day, my main focus still is trying to reach, optimal performance and kind of get as much out of myself as I can. And that being the measuring point makes it a little less direct to target, like say X number of millimoles in your blood ketones. So for me, I much prefer kind of a field test, because I think we can learn a lot from laboratory studies, and it can create a really good kind of spot to start from, or a place to maybe start teasing out what may or may not work and give you kind of a little bit of a guide as to what direction to go. But ultimately, I prefer the field tests because they show what's actually happening, doing what I'm trying to do. So I've got a couple kind of field tests that I like to do to know if I'm at a position where I'm fat adapted enough for a race. And usually what I'll do is I'll use the workout that is closest related to the race itself, which in the world of ultramarathoning, that tends to be the long run, or sometimes you might have a weekend block of training where you're doing kind of 2 long runs back to back. And I usually start looking at that when I'm, past the midway point of my training program, where I'll pick maybe 3 long runs in my last 6 weeks of training for a race. And I'll go out with the mindset of I'm going to just take in water and electrolytes for this long run. And if my energy levels are consistently good and I'm not having these big ebbs and flows or getting that kind of like bonk, so to speak, by only fueling on water and electrolytes at that long run intensity, then I know I'm fat adapted enough to be able to execute the race in the way I kind of want to. And then what I do is, once I kind of have that pinned down where I know I'm where I want to be from that side of things, I start playing around with what I'm going to do in the race itself from a nutrition side of things, just so I know, like, okay, this protocol is still working. This is, still the way I want to go for this race. And it gives me a little bit of opportunity to kind of play around with that stuff before I go into the race with a real detailed kind of nutrition plan.
Have you done metabolic efficiency testing out on the trails? Like there's a company, for example, I met in Hawaii, Ironman last year, Pinoy, they have a backpack that you can run with, instead of being on a treadmill, you can be out in the trail and really test what heart rate and how much fat you are burning in your RQ value, metabolic crossover point, and all that data.
Yeah, I haven't really done a whole lot of that. Certainly not on the trails. I was one of the participants in the FASTER study that Volek did back. I believe that's back in 2014 at this point. And it was on a treadmill, but they ran all those numbers there. So I have an idea, I guess, of kind of where I'm at, given kind of the parameters of that specific study, which had the high fat cohort at 10% or less carbohydrate intake. And I believe for that study, my peak fat oxidation rate was like 1.56 grams per minute. And for listeners who aren't maybe familiar with typical ranges, is before the FASTER study, a lot of the literature would point to kind of a 0.9 to 1.0 grams per minute as being kind of like an outlier in the high end of fat oxidation. So that was a bit of a data point that showed me personally that you can manipulate that through diet. You can manipulate it through exercise as well, but if you're doing both, you can probably push that further over. So that information was fairly useful from an analytic standpoint. But at the end of the day, I think it's more important to just do the actual field test and ultimately develop like an idea of how you feel at certain points, because ultimately when you're running an ultra marathon, you get to that like 10th, 11th, 12th, and some cases 20th, 23rd, 24th hour. You're really losing connection to a lot of data points, I think, at that, and you're just really dialing in like your rate of perceived exertion and trying to, push that mental barrier more than a physical one almost at that point. So having a better idea just with what your body's telling you as opposed to what a number is telling you is more advantageous, at least at this point.
Yeah. Well, I just did a podcast and doing a follow-up podcast with Peter Duffy, does a optimized fat metabolism program, OFM, and does Vespa. And he was saying the same thing, is that makes sense to me. It's kind of what I've always done without really thinking of a name, but intuitive training and just listening to your body and being in touch with your energy levels and how you overall feel to know when to fuel and how to pace yourself a little bit, as well as daily.
Yeah, Peter's really good at that. I worked with Peter really closely the first few years that I was kind of playing around with this approach. So I definitely bounced a lot of ideas off him in the past. And from me, my entrance point into kind of a high fat, low carb was through a lot of the keto kind of messaging. So his OFM program, I think, is the first I've seen that kind of introduced this idea of, okay, let's make this contextual to your lifestyle, and you're an endurance athlete or you're an extreme endurance athlete. So, working with, from a performance angle, let's look at what role carbs play and let's start viewing them more as a tool as opposed to like the foundation of your nutrition, but not necessarily demonize them altogether either.
Yeah. So going back to the FASTER study, I know that was so many months beforehand to get following a keto diet, and then you did this big test. What are your biggest takeaways from that experience?
From the FASTER study in general, or?
Yeah, just from doing that experiment and the treadmill test itself and the results. What did you get changed your viewpoint on anything, or how you approach your day-to-day training and fueling and recovery?
Yeah, I think if anything, it probably showed me that, it kind of confirmed a lot of what I was kind of noticing in my own approach, where like there's this, I guess maybe I should back up and say, like, I think a lot of times when people look at high fat, low carb, and then they look at high carb, low fat, they're kind of looking at it black and white, where, it's kind of an all or nothing situation where you either have to be like super keto adapted or you have to be, super high carb, and there's not a whole lot of middle ground. So for me, it was more intriguing. The more intriguing thing was like, well, I can get my fat oxidation up to this with, this kind of range or percentage of carbohydrate intake. And then I kind of have an idea of like, well, how fat adapted do I need to be versus how fat adapted can I get? Because I could push that needle higher. I could push that needle where I'm burning higher than 1.56 grams per minute. But at what cost is the kind of the question that comes next. And does that elicit an additional improvement, or does it regress your performance and that sort of thing? So I think there's like a little bit of a balancing act where you want to start looking at it more along the lines of a sliding scale of, well, what's my goal race? What's my goal race's intensity? What's the training going to look like to do that? And kind of how do I structure a nutrition program that's going to have me fat adapted enough for that specific effort? And it gets a little confusing, I think, when you get into the weeds with it, because, a lot of times you see, other kind of nebulous terms like endurance, where like, well, what are we talking about with endurance? Are we talking about like a 3,000 meter track race? Are we talking about a 24-hour timed event? And, they both fit within that kind of umbrella of endurance, but they're very different systems of energy or systems of intensity that you're going to be doing during race day itself. So a lot of times, like, my philosophy when it comes to building a training program for either me or someone I'm coaching is we identify a race or a goal event that they're trying to do, and then we kind of build backwards. And one of the big kind of points of interest with that is like, well, what's the intensity and the intensity of the race itself? And then we're going to structure a plan so that your workouts are most specific to your race day intensity as we get closer to the race. So you're kind of building your fitness from an endurance standpoint towards the event. And that will also structure kind of how I would manipulate my own diet within that range, where, if I'm doing some shorter, faster intervals earlier in the training program because the race itself is long, and I'm going to kind of skew away from those as I get closer to the race and focus in more on kind of the longer, slow stuff. That might be a situation where my highest carb intake will come earlier in that training block. Whereas if I were to train for, say, like, something shorter, like less than a marathon, there's going to be some intensity sessions near the end of that training block that are close to race pace, where I may skew some of my carb intake up a little bit near the end of the training program. So ultimately, it just kind of matches intensities with the fuel you're burning, and then in looking at it holistically too, because I think a lot of times people will look at the event solely and think, okay, this event is high intensity, therefore I need to always be eating high intensity. Or this event is low intensity, so I should always be eating low intensity, and they're ignoring all those pieces of the puzzle that get them to the event, which is the majority of the time and the majority of the food you're going to eat.
Yeah, that's great points. We were just talking a lot about that recently, about carb dosing, and I hear all these questions in Facebook groups for endurance athletes being keto endurance and, low carb athlete. And if you're primal paleo or whatever it is I think it gets confusing out there, because a lot of, like what Peter and I were talking about, a lot of the research, as you mentioned earlier as well, is on the ketogenic diet is more for health and for different diseases, chronic diseases. And there's not as much research on endurance athlete sports and how low of carb you should go. And everyone wants to know a number. And it's always like, it depends, no one's the same. But like you're saying, you have to match your intensity and what race you're doing to figure out how much carbs you can tolerate and still stay primarily burning fat. What you're saying?
Yeah. And I think, I did an N=1 experiment last fall too, because partly just because I love to do the intuitive side of things, but I also get a lot of questions. So it's hard to tell someone like how I'm feeling and then have them somehow, internalize that and then figure it out for themselves. So, last fall, I picked one of my bigger training blocks leading into a race I was training for, and I just tested my blood ketone levels about 2 or 3 times, usually 3 times a day. And during that specific phase of training was when my carbohydrates were at their highest, and I was still producing, blood ketones at 0.5 to 2.0 millimoles pretty consistently of all the tests I did. I did it for about, I have to look back at my notes to know exactly, but I think it was like just over 3 weeks total. And I was maybe outside of that 0.5 or above range twice in that. So, even in the context of my higher carb phases, which I should probably clarify are still quite a bit lower than like what you would see in traditional endurance carbohydrate fueling, which is going to probably point you to maybe like a 60-70% intake. For me, historically, it's usually been closer to 20%. I was still burning enough fat to be producing what would be considered a ketogenic state more often than not. So that was really interesting to me to know that my body was able to kind of do that. And that wasn't the case when I first started. So that leads me to suspect that there is something to the consistency and the length that you've kind of put the program in place. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I first started, when I was only doing it for a handful of months, if I went and took in the level of carbohydrates I took in, it might bump me out of ketosis altogether for a longer period of time. Whereas now it seems like my body's able to kind of move back into that or switch gears back and forth a little more efficiently, which I think would be what folks would probably call real good metabolic flexibility, where you're able to utilize the carbs when you need them, but not necessarily have them kind of thwart your fat adaptation goals either. And for me, that's kind of the sweet spot because, when you're running 100 miles, you want as many tools as you can get.
Yeah, I'm sure. I've done a 50K. I can't imagine doing 100. My husband trained for a 50 miler, the North Face one, and we're in Headlands when I did 50K. It's like 100. He thought about 100 for a day. Like, no, that's a big commitment doing that. So how do you eat day to day? Like, do you have kind of a more of a ketogenic fuel plan of meals that you cook, or what's your kind of way to eat and keep yourself going day to day?
Yeah, so that's a question that I always have a hard time answering because I feel like I'm always going to mislead at least one person, but I'll do my best. So
what's good for you though? Everyone remember, this is what Zack Bitter eats. Is not like what Michael Phelps is going to eat or what you eat. Everyone's different.
Well, and he's probably a perfect example of that too, because you look at like what he's eating during some of his biggest training sessions and people just automatically assume that's every day, 365 days a year. And that's usually what I tell folks is I'm kind of an interesting case because, if you ask me what I eat during a specific day and it happens to be a day I'm running 100 miles, that's going to look quite a bit different than what I'm maybe going to eat the day after that, where I'm going to be hopefully barely moving at all. And that's the extreme end of the side of things. There's a little more consistency than that in most cases. But a good example that I like to share with folks is when I think of like nutrition, I tend to try to get away from this idea of, okay, we have this 24-hour window and I need to get this amount of this in this 24 hours. And then after that cycle ends, you restart and do it again. I try to look at it more in like, say, like a 3-day window of time. And the reason for that is because the best example is I can even go back to this most recent training session I just did. I had, yesterday I did a training run that was just under 33 miles, 3.5 hours. And, I probably burnt close to 3 times my resting metabolic rate that day. And then today, since I did a workout that large yesterday, I'm barely going to run at all. So, what I eat that day where my energy demands are very high, I could see a lot of people looking at that and thinking like, okay, I need to eat, say, like 5,000 or 6,000 calories to meet that energy demand. Whereas I look at it as, well, I'm going to run a calorie deficit this day, but tomorrow I'm not going to run at all or hardly work out at all. So I have a really good opportunity to make up part of that calorie deficit on a day where I'm less active. And then it just becomes a little less of like forcing yourself to eat maybe when you don't want to, and then abstaining from eating when you do want to. And that ends up usually being closer to kind of like a 3-day window. So when you look at kind of what I'm eating on a daily basis, I do have kind of like a baseline where I'm looking to kind of get like probably around a couple thousand calories a day that are fairly consistent, that it's basically just fat and protein. So I'll get like fatty cuts of meat, and I'll get like a beef tallow or something to add to it. Sometimes if I want to get the fat ratios up a little higher. And then once I kind of get to that, that'd be like a no energy expenditure, a resting metabolic day, I guess. And then after that, I start adding to it to kind of meet the demands of what I'm doing. And that'll end up being kind of the way I start things off. And I usually know my training program far enough ahead. I try to respond based on my body feels too, but I've got a good enough idea, and I've been doing it long enough where I can usually predict pretty close, like how much recovery I'm going to require from a specific workout, and kind of plan a little bit out from there. And once I start introducing some more like higher volume phases and some higher intensity phases, I might bring back some carbohydrates for those, and those will probably come in the form of like, potatoes, melons, berries, raw honey are some that I kind of gravitate towards. What I usually tell folks with that is, when you're doing kind of a program like I am, where you're doing some periodized carbohydrate reintroductions, is, focus on some of the carbohydrate sources that maybe you used to eat and enjoy, but aren't any longer because you were just going through like a stricter keto phase of your training or your nutrition plan. And identify those and use those as kind of your carb sneak tools. And that could be different from every person, just depending on what they prefer. I tend to gravitate towards, like I said, the potatoes, melons, berries, that sort of thing. Then it's just a kind of a process of deciding how much of that is enough. I try to like look at it the same way I would coffee or caffeine, where, a little bit is going to give me a performance boost, but there's a margin of diminishing returns where if I just go to that well so many times, I'm not necessarily going to get any advantage from that, but and possibly elicit a disadvantage. So I try to be kind of careful with that. And a lot of that's just kind of a lot of self-experimentation over the years, where, I've done so many workouts so many times with a variety of different kind of nutrition approaches for them, that you start to identify like which ones you feel best on, which ones you don't feel as good, and kind of where's the upper and lower limit of what you need for carbohydrate reintroduction. Usually I like to share with people too, like if you look at it from the macro lens, where you're looking at my entire year, I'm probably averaging somewhere around 10% carbohydrate intake when you add in like the days where I'm going hyper low, like recovery days or off season type stuff. And then combining that in with my higher training volume and intensity phases where my carbohydrates tend to be at their highest.
So that's what I was just talking about too the other day about caffeine and carbs. It's like that. Just take it out and then put it back in when appropriate to get that performance boost. So it's a good analogy, because we all know we could take away coffee for a little bit, that it might make a difference. Yeah, have it every day, can't tell.
I think it makes a lot of sense too, because like I know I can speak from experience. When I was high carbohydrate, you take in an exogenous carbohydrate source and you notice what you notice, but you kind of start to normalize it. So until you kind of put yourself in a different position, you don't really realize how potent it can be. And, for me, that just tends to be, I can generate the same potency from about half as much carbohydrate during a race or a big workout as I would have in the past when I was following a high carb diet. And I kind of think of that same way with coffee. If I drank 5 cups of coffee every day, I would start to, if I wanted to get like an increased effect, I'd have to go up to 6 or 7 cups of coffee. Whereas if I was drinking 1 cup of coffee a day and I wanted an extra boost, I could move up to 2 and I would get it. So it's all kind of like where you put your framework or where you put your foundation in. And for me, I found that foundation of fat is a good route for me.
So are you experimenting with a keto carnivore then? Just eating more good sources of healthy fatty meats?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it probably depends on who you ask. Carnivore, I think, is, you get folks. Yeah, I mean, you get someone who's literally eating only animal products, and then you get folks who are eating like say 70% plus, which I think is now termed hypercarnivore, if I'm remembering right. I was following a Twitter thread a while back, and they were trying to decide like what entails what. But yeah, I that's the foundation of my diet is animal fats and animal proteins, and then I'm just gonna like fine tune it, I guess, with other things to kind of maximize performance. So that's an interesting approach, and it's I've tried other ways too. I've tried going where like I limit the amount of animal protein and animal fats and focus more on like things like coconut oil and nuts and seeds and things like that. And it's, for me it seems different, but I know there's people out there who've essentially done like a vegan keto diet and have found success in whatever they're doing too. So it's pretty interesting to kind of look at the ranges.
Well, I find it so unique to each person. You got to look at genetics, like where your ancestors are background. So find more Northern European versus, they say, north of the equator, south of the equator. That could influence your ability to tolerate more carbs. I've also been taught metabolic typing, if you're a slow oxidizer or fast oxidizer, gut health, digestion. There's so much to it. But I think nutritional therapy, we always teach people to eat right to balance your blood sugar. And I think most of us are so damaged from eating a high carb, non-fat diet their whole lives, if you're my age range, that we majority of people seem to do better on a lower carb, higher fat diet. And then there's people with gut inflammation and different stuff going on inside that they do better on more of a carnivore after going to KetoCon. And I was speaking on Jimmy Moore's low carb keto cruise, and I'm talking to all these people about carnivore that I like, what, who wants to just meat all the time? Especially like my friend Danny Vega, I'm interviewing next week, but it's, eating head or nose to tail and eating all that stuff. I mean, I get it, but it's also, I think, sustainability and enjoying what you're eating too. I'm not going to eat, what does he make? These organ burgers and stuff like that. Not for me, but I get it. And you get all these micronutrients that fuel your body. But anyways, I just think it needs to be something you enjoy. That's not a diet, that you feel the performance gains and you'll be able to do it all the time. You don't feel like you're restricting yourself. And knowing as an endurance athlete, you can add a little more carbohydrates on heavier training days or when you're doing higher heart rate work. So I think people get freaked out that they have to stay so low, and they go by what all these other people are saying, not be intuitive training and fueling, as you said.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting topic. And I think it's easy for people to get in that mindset where they have things kind of moving smoothly for a few days and then something happens and they break protocol to just like abandon altogether, as opposed to just say, hey, I've been nailing this at 80, 90% accuracy. That's a step in the right direction. Let's stay the course and see what happens. But like ultimately, I think you need to be honest with yourself and find out like, well, what are you going to be able to actually stick to? And, one thing I find really interesting is you look at like the studies of like diet adherence, and when people are following a specific diet for reasons that they were essentially told to versus them just kind of gravitating to it naturally, there's like a massive failure rate. It's something like 95% failure rate. So you can look at that in a dismal light and say like, well, we're doomed. No one can stick to a nutrition program. Or you can look at it as well, this is probably a good reason why we should have a variety of different options, because I think like given enough options and the flexibility to try them out, people are going to find what works for them. People are going to find what they can stick to and what they can adhere to. And once they can kind of get that system in place, they can start fine tuning things, whether it be for like muscle gain or fat loss and all these other things that people are looking to try to achieve with their diet.
So last question, we're just running out of time already, but fasted workouts for you, intermittent fasting, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I probably know enough to be dangerous, but the way I look at fasting is I don't plan it. I don't look at it as something where I'm going to like specifically pick a day in the calendar and say I'm going to do like a 20-hour fast or eat within a specific feeding window. What I find works best for me is like, I might have a day where I am just eating a lot. And if I eat way above my energy demands that day, and the next day I'm not hungry when I would normally eat, I'm not going to eat just for the sake of eating. I'm going to wait till I get hungry. So sometimes that leads to kind of an impromptu fast that wasn't necessarily planned. It just kind of happens naturally. And I think that's kind of a good way to do it for me personally, because when I look at fasting, I think most people are looking at it from a time standpoint. They're thinking like, well, if I get to 24 hours, I may see this physiological benefit or something like that. And for me, I'm looking at it from an energy output standpoint. So for me, a 24-hour window of time can mean a lot of different things, kind of like what I was talking about before. I could go through a 24-hour window where I burn like 6,000 calories, which is going to, from an energy standpoint, look a lot more like a 72-hour fast for someone who's not working out at all. So I'm trying to be cognizant of that. And I'm also trying to be cognizant of like where the efficacy of that would be from a performance standpoint. And with performance being kind of your compass, that's maybe a little different than, say, someone who's looking at things from a longevity standpoint. And I think you can piece those together to a degree, but there's a lot of kind of maybe opposing angles that you can also consider with performance versus longevity and things like that too. So for me, I just haven't really used it as a tool that is going to be very structured outside of intuition.
Yeah. Well, that's so with me. I totally agree that when you're eating higher fat, low carb, ketogenic diet, metabolically efficient, fat adapted, whatever title you want to give it, I think you end up not eating. Like I haven't eaten yet today and it's 2:40 and I lifted weights this morning. I work with clients and I went swimming and I'll eat my meal after this, but that ends up being one meal a day. So until a year ago, I didn't know it was OMAD, air quotes. And then fasting, I didn't know I was doing, it just happened naturally. So I think it works best to do fasting or intermittent fasting when you're not even trying to do it. Because then I think you're focused on what am I going to eat next? When am I going to eat? What time is it? How long do I have to work? And then to me, it's another source of stress. And my whole story is cut out the stress, external stressors. We don't need them. Do what you can do to manage it. So when it becomes natural, I'm not fixated on food. When you can't have something, I think it just is so much easier if you have this mindset.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people, they look at some of these, I guess you could say like ancient traditions like fasting and like heat exposure, cold exposure and things like that. And you look at them in isolation and they have these like wonderful benefits that you can point to. But then you also have to look at that as these are inducing a physiological stress on yourself. And it goes back to what we were talking before. It's like, are you in a position to take on more stress? So one thing I always worry about is when people, they get like super excited about any one kind of approach and they decide, well, I'm going to go on a ketogenic diet. I'm going to start doing cold water plunges. I'm going to do red sauna and I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. It's like, let's maybe micro stress and let's try one of these first. And if you feel good and you get that figured out, then we can start looking at maybe some of these other things and let your body kind of get built up to be able to kind of tolerate that before you start adding so much stuff that, like you said, you're thinking about things so much that you're overstressing. And I think if you find yourself fasting and you're constantly thinking about the end of the fast, you're probably not doing it right. So I think there's a lot of intuition that could be used and beneficial from that stress reduction side of things.
Totally. Well, we're out of time, but where can people find you? What's up next for Zack Bitter? What's going on?
Cool. Yeah, the easiest spot to kind of find all my different things would be my website at zackbitter.com. I'm probably the most active on Instagram and Twitter, which Instagram is at ZackBitter and Twitter is at ZBitter. But yeah, all that stuff can be found on the website. I'm doing a couple of races this year on the schedule yet. I'm doing a 12-hour event in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the Olympic Training Facility. It's just how far you can run in 12 hours. And then kind of the more exciting one, because that one is a fairly monotonous 400-meter track indoors.
12 hours.
Yeah. Well, the kicker is I'm probably going to be the one on the track the least that day because it's actually an event that goes up to 6 days. So some folks are going to be running as far as they can get in 6 days. And it's up to them how much they decide to sleep during that time. But some people are crazy. I've seen guys go like as little as 8 to 10 hours of sleep during those events. And it's a different world for sure. So I'm trying to blend it and break the monotony a bit. My wife and I are going out to Greece in September to do one of the older ultra marathons called the Spartathlon. It's a 153-mile race on some kind of rolling road route from Athens to Sparta. So that one will be a little more exciting, I think.
Can you go on vacation afterwards and go to like Santorini and all the Greek islands? Yeah,
definitely. My wife's actually Greek. Her dad's side of the family still lives over there. So they're waiting for us and ready to show us around. So we're looking forward to it.
I was just talking to someone after my swim workout before we podcasted today about taking a boat, being out in the islands on the water is so beautiful. And I love Santorini. Yeah, and it's just a great place to go. So anyways, you deserve vacation after that. That's a tough one.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks for your time and sharing your great stories and training tips. And hopefully people can reach out to find more if they're doing endurance running, want to learn how to become a fat adapted endurance athlete if you're going for that 50K, 100-mile, those ultra runs. So thanks, Zack.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at wholeathletepodcast.com. You can help us continue and grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and see you next time.